Hi, good evening. Hi. Can you hear me all right? Good. Thank you very much for that introduction. Thank you all very much for being here. It's an absolute pleasure. It's an honor considering the quality of the speakers we've been listening to. This has been absolutely fascinating. These are all very much my jam. The questions around surveillance, political technologies, all kinds of different technologies, and their political, governmental, social implications are stuff I've been trying to think about for some time. And I know, and I've spent a lot of time also with some of that darkness and some of the worst aspects of it. And recently I've been starting to try and think of ways beyond that darkness, essentially. But not in order to dispel it entirely, not to pretend that it doesn't exist, but to think about how some of the things that have been learned along that process can actually help us to genuinely address these things. And I'm at a very early stage of that process. So the things that I'm talking about this evening are very, very initial sketch out thoughts, but I thought they might be interesting, coming as honored as I am to be the last speaker, to bridge the last couple of days. Because I realize I'm actually kind of starting with a cartography and using it to describe a cosmology. I hope what I mean by that will become clear in a sec. So yeah, I'm just going to get on with it. We can talk about it later. We're slowing down as the evening is. It's all good. This is Epirus in northern Greece. This turns out to be one of the most beautiful places in the world. I've been there several times now, but only quite recently. It's just a really, really stunning and largely unspoilt, a word that's kind of overused or underused or misused a lot. But like, not a lot has happened there for a long time, and in a good way. It's mountainous, it's very dense, but lowly populated. It's resisted most invasions. It's a very hard place to invade. It's a natural refuge in many ways. And it's absolutely stunning, and it's culturally fascinating, and brilliant and beautiful. And I went up there, and I hung out with some people by this lake. And I just can't describe how nice it was, sorry. Like, we made a little fire, the guys were pulling fish out of the lake and cooking them, we were drinking beers. The guy had a clarinet, and he started wandering around in the woods playing the folk music of the area, which is incredibly stunningly beautiful. It's a very special place. And as I was there, I started wandering around in the woods, these woods around this lake. And I started coming across these things. Every kind of 10, 15 meters. These were wooden stakes that had been driven into the ground. There were these bits of colored tape. You can kind of see them heading off into the bushes, bits of spray paint, these kind of hand numbers that had been drawn onto these wooden stakes. And unfortunately, they were also kind of the reason I was there, because these are the physical instantiations of a virtual grid that's been drawn over Epirus, over most of Western Greece, in the last couple of years, because they're survey lines of oil and gas exploration. So this is one of many, many maps that are subdividing up Western Greece and parts of the Aegean into, and the Adriatic into a grid for exploration. Because there's potentially large oil and gas reserves in this region. And it's extraordinary the way in which this totally virtual grid, drawn like neatly on a map, actually manifests like on the ground as you're walking around there. And I was talking to the people who are trying to resist this. It's an incredibly violent process, as you know, long before even the actual oil rigs turn up and like leak and destroy everything. The actual exploration process involves digging holes in the ground, dropping explosives down them, and monitoring the seismic vibrations to see where the oil well is. So even just the process of exploration is pretty bad, and people are trying to oppose that, but it's hard. And I was researching, trying to understand this process and the companies behind it. The company that's working up there is a company called Repsol. It's a big Spanish oil and gas company. And I was trying to find out a bit more about them, and actually I kept coming across their links to technology companies. I just keep going places and meeting these bastards, basically, is what happens. I go to the highest mountains in Greece, and there they are, working with oil companies on a number of different ways, but primarily on all this fancy machine learning stuff you may have heard about. which is the latest kind of magic fairy dust, which we're told is going to be good for us in all these kind of ways, but of course the big money is still in oil and gas. So Google is helping Repsol make their oil refineries more efficient. Brilliant, because what we need is more efficient oil refineries. IBM are working with Repsol actually specifically on identifying new fields, which is the bit that's relevant in northern Greece. The oil is like running out, but there's still loads of it. And one of the really frustrating things about that is as there's less of it, it becomes more valuable, right? Which means you can spend more profitably to extract it. So you can go after the places that were previously harder to get to. There's always been known that there's oil in Epirus. In fact, there's places you can go. I went to this river and I'm walking down this beautifully, you can actually smell gas. And that wasn't from an oil refinery or something, that was literally just kind of coming up from the ground. And this has been known for thousands of years. You don't need like artificial intelligence to really find it, but you need it to exploit it. That's the thing that's changed here. Artificial intelligence is the gap between the ability to just know it's there and actually to exploit it profitably. And I had this kind of really horrible realization as I was kind of finding out about this and looking at this beautiful forest. There's a fairly hoary old now story, or like one of the warning stories people tell about artificial intelligence, which is known as the Paperclip Theory. It's a theory about what might happen with runaway artificial intelligence. And it goes roughly, briefly like this, which is that if you build a computer smart enough to run a very, very efficient paperclip factory, right? You want loads of paperclips, you make a machine, it optimizes the entire paperclip production process. And you think, well, if we keep making the machine more intelligent, it'll keep making more and more better paperclips, and therefore more and more profit from paperclips. And if you keep augmenting that machine, and you don't, if you're not clever, if you don't close off every possible safeguard around the intelligence of that machine, well, what might it do next? Might it start also trading in paperclip futures? Might it start acting on the stock exchange so that it can improve the profitability of the paperclips? Might it start buying and selling competitors or the suppliers of paperclips? Might it look at getting into mining so that actually this one company could also be involved in all of these things? Would it eventually start to look at all the different materials, whether that's iron ore or whether it's everything around us, including the bodies of other humans that might profitably be turned into paperclips? Because it has no other ethical boundaries. It simply believes that this is its optimization task, and the thing that it must do is make more paperclips. And it will make them out of the entire surface of the Earth until it sends into rockets to turn Jupiter into paperclips. That will be its plan. And it's a funny story. It's also completely morally true in that sense. The only problem is the AI doesn't want paperclips. The AI wants oil, right? And that's actually precisely what is happening. Despite the silliness of the paperclip sounding story, the artificial intelligence that we've kind of released is seeking to destroy the planet in this very, very direct way. And I realized looking at these stakes in the ground that I was looking at kind of like the tooth marks of an artificial intelligence, the kind of claws of this thing as it moved its way through the world, which is a really weird thing to see when you're surrounded by all the discourse of how kind of amazing AI is and all this kind of stuff. And despite everything we've been talking about today, the discourse that technology somehow ascends towards something that is better for us or whatever. But none of you believe this anymore because you've heard the previous talk, so that's fine. But it really bothers me that this form of intelligence is the one that we seem to be opting for as the thing we're building and designing. And I had to kind of think over that for a while. There's talking about artificial intelligence in general, people often ask, when will we have it? And for a long time, I've given a joke answer to that, which is that it's already here, it's corporations. Corporations are large, goal-directed organizations. They have censors and effectors. They have pleasure and pain points, profit and lawsuits, stuff like this. They are self-organizing organisms. They're quite hard, but not entirely impossible to kill. They are artificial intelligences that operate in the world in the present. They have legal standing in many places, for example, something that lots of other AIs don't at present. And I said that answer was always semi-joking, though I think that has a lot of truth to it. But I realized in looking at these forms of AI, these extractivist forms, the oil forms that we're getting, that actually the model of intelligence that we're putting into artificial intelligence is precisely a corporate intelligence. Like that's the only model of AI we seem to be building is this model of corporate intelligence that we have. Something that's essentially deeply extractivist, that's completely sort of power hungry, and that doesn't really have any other kind of limits. It's such a narrow form of intelligence that I find to be kind of quite terrifying, quite strange. And you see this played out in kind of every way that it's working out. You see it in the complete kind of game obsession of AI, which is very weird when you kind of think about it, I feel, that we build all these machines, these incredibly powerful machines, just to beat humans. Right? To beat the one thing that makes us like really happy and makes us feel that we're great. Oh, cool! We'll build a machine to destroy a human at that. Like it's a model of intelligence in general, but also of social relations that is obviously and quite clearly sort of something that's quite disturbing. I have a lot more to say about the game playing, but there's also the fact that it is, and this is something that is. I think there's two interesting sides to something something deeply opaque about it and something deeply unknowable about it, which I think is also a really interesting quality of contemporary artificial intelligence. This is Alphago, its online version. Most people know about the version of Alphago that beat Lee Sedol, the Korean Go master, in one-to-one play. Google also trained that AI online, playing anonymously against human players, beating grandmasters online undercover as another player on online servers. And what's strange about that, people figured out after a while it was definitely a machine. But the thing about Alphago, whether it's playing online or whether it's playing a human player, is it's not just that we've been beaten by this machine, it's that we don't understand how it made the decisions that beat us. That's the bit of it that I find fundamentally somewhat worrying. Because it doesn't just mean we're not very good at the game anymore, it means we're just completely out of the game entirely. The game is happening over there in a place that we can't even consider or participate in. It's a particularly kind of violent form of the kind of appropriation of that knowledge. And in thinking about that, I've been thinking about other intelligences, which is the title of this talk, because it strikes me that there's something fundamentally missing, as I said, in the forms in which we're constructing these forms of intelligence, in the narrowness of this intelligence, but also in the weird cultural obsession we have with artificial intelligence in the present. It's something that you see everywhere, that is discussed all the time, that is perceived to be at the kind of forefront of technological expansion, even as it threatens to kind of replace us, essentially, and certainly to reduce us. And yet at the same time, the last 10, 20 years in particular, there's been an extraordinary explosion in scientific understanding of non-human intelligences, of intelligences totally and the other direction, unlike the human. Which have the potential to teach us so much more about what forms of intelligence are possible, might exist, and might allow us to think differently about the world. The one you've probably heard about, if you've heard about any of this kind of stuff, is the octopus, which has become the kind of charismatic megafauna of non-human intelligence. But for quite good and interesting reasons. And if you haven't heard or need reminding about what is so particularly fascinating about why the octopus and cephalopods in general, the squids and the cuttlefish, have become kind of emblematic of this. I'd make it, there's one kind of point, which is that the cephalopods and humans share a common ancestor, in the sense that all life shares a common ancestor. If you go back long enough through various layers of evolution, you get to one thing that we both were. In the case of humans and cephalopods, that's a tiny blind flatworm that lived at the bottom of the ocean about 40 or maybe 400 million years ago. Deep, deep time stuff, right? But we share it. We were both there in that little worm in some form. What's noticeable is that worm was blind, right? But he's got an eye, it's got an eye, they've got an eye, this dude's got an eye, of indeterminate gender I, and I have an eye, those eyes evolved separately. They both evolved from that flatworm, but they evolved around two different paths of evolution. They're remarkably similar. The octopus and us, we both have like these small spherical eyes filled with goo that we have focusing lenses and so on and so forth. Actually, the octopus one is slightly better in that its optic nerve doesn't come in at the back like ours, so it doesn't have a blind spot. They evolved separately along this way. It's an example of convergent evolution. And the argument that's increasingly being made is that maybe intelligence looks something like that as well. This idea that we've had for so long, that intelligence is like a kind of graduated slope with us at the top, you know, and then various lesser beings kind of all the way down. That's not the case. Intelligence, like most forms of life, appears to be some kind of branching tree, that with intelligence flowering differently in different places. And that's the kind of lesson, one of the lessons we can take from the octopus, that when we talk about other intelligences, we're talking about multiple forms of intelligence. Intelligence that comes in different places, in different contexts, in different beings, in radically different ways, but is no less identifiable as intelligence for doing so. The way in which we talk and understand about these things is really super interesting and challenges how we, for me, how we think about a context and how we relate to one another. I was reading this really fascinating paper recently about plant hearing. So there's this particular experiment, the researchers had set up an experiment where there was a plant, they put a bunch of caterpillars on it, munch, 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 and they measured the plant's response, which the plant does a few things. It releases some stuff through its roots, maybe some pheromones, there's gas, as a warning to other plants. That's part of the plant communication, which we've also been finding out about. But what they then did next was that they took the caterpillars away, they stuck the plants there, they measured their responses while they just played them the sound of caterpillars munching. And it turned out the plants did exactly the same response. And they were like, hang on a second, plants can hear. And they published this and were like, plants can hear, everybody. And then a bunch of other scientists came along and were like, they don't have ears, they don't have auditory canals, they don't have all the stuff you need for hearing. And they were like, dudes, they can hear. And we're in this really weird place where we're starting to acknowledge the abilities of non-humans in all kinds of forms, more than humans, without having really the understanding of the mechanisms, which is a super, super interesting place to be. And for me, calls on a certain kind of trust that we need to have in certain forms of evidence without demanding other certain forms of evidence, shall I say. But it also asks us to ask, like, you know, how can we understand that? Because this is a case a bit like the AI, at least at the moment. I'm sure we'll make some amazing discovery, but let's move forward now. Like with the AI, where we cannot understand the decisions that it makes, but we have to live with it. How do we live with that, and how do we live with this? And for me, I think a lot about this idea that I can't experience the Umwelt of the plant, however much else I want to. Like the world of the plant is not my world, except that it is because it's all of the world to some extent. We both exist in the world. Right? And I think there were some really interesting discussions yesterday about what constitutes sharing in this situation. When it was said that the questions around empathy, questions around what constitutes, can animals be considered as humans and therefore we have a shared humanity? And I also want to put forward a world in which we're not the same in fundamental ways, and yet share a world and can therefore understand our relationship through a sharing of that world. The quality of sound is something that we share, the vibrations of the world are something that we share, and therefore this thing exists meaningfully in the same ways that we do. And we have a huge amount of weird, stupid anthropomorphic bias to get over, of which one of this is my favorite story. One of the ways in which we test the intelligence of non-humans is we basically see if they're like us. The history of intelligence is basically, or the definition of intelligence has always basically been like what we do. So anything else that wants to be intelligent has to prove it can do the stuff that we can do. One of which is tool use, right? We're very proud of that. We're very good at it. You know, tap, tap, tap. So one of the tests they used on apes for a long time to decide which apes were intelligent and which weren't was that they'd, cage them, or they'd probably already in a cage because we're humans. They give them a stick, and then they put some food out of reach, and like if the ape could get the thing with the stick, he was like, brilliant, they're intelligent. And they did this with chimpanzees, and they did this with gorillas, and they did this with orangs. They did this with all of them. But all the greater apes, the higher apes as we call them, passed this, apart from gibbons, who just didn't, right? They just didn't. And everyone was really bothered, because they're quite big, their brains are big, they do all this other cool stuff. They're just not tool users, so they just can't be as smart as everyone else. And it took ages. There was this a decade of basically thinking gibbons were dumber than everything else. Until one day, one of the researchers realized that the main thing about gibbons that differentiates them from the other higher apes is that they're brachiators. They live in the trees. They spend their time in a completely different physical space to other great apes, like in a different kind of physical bodily awareness. And the moment the researchers basically, they just put hooks on the top of the tool sticks they've been using, hung them from the top of the enclosures, so that they were kind of more like branches, and the gibbons immediately went, oh, cheers, right? And became intelligent in that moment, as according to the definitions of science in this way. And all of that was human blindness, like a complete unawareness, a lack of, at some point, empathy, but at another level, kind of understanding or thinking to imagine what it might look like from this other angle. And the whole history of deciding who has intelligence looks a lot like that. When you start to get into this, then it all just starts to get brilliantly messy and complex, kind of very, very quickly. What's called the human microbiome is the sort of 2 to 3 kilograms of other life that lives on and within you at all times, primarily in your gut, but kind of bits on your skin and stuff like this. There's a huge amount of this stuff kind of sloshing around, and it's us. We're just like big bags of other beings, essentially, and they're in our heads as well, not necessarily literally. Actually, the ones in your gut, the makeup and the health of the various microorganisms that live in your gut demonstrably affect your intelligence. They can change your cognitive ability based on basically how healthy your gut biota is. So we're already in a kind of, let alone their intelligence, our intelligence is being moderated by a constant interaction with other beings that live inside us, which is just cool. And we're only also just beginning to understand the extent to which other things are constituted differently. I forgot to mention the octopus, which there's a thing I want to say about the octopus before. The other way in which octopuses are really substantially, brilliantly different is that they're not brains on legs like we are, even though they've got more legs. In fact, because they've got more legs, the octopus brain is distributed throughout its entire body. So whereas all our neurons are in a big bunch in our heads, octopus's ones extend all the way through their bodies, they go down their arms, and appear to act independently. So the arms of the octopus don't just take commands from the head. They appear to be kind of semi-autonomous cells within the body politic that are doing their own things in a kind of loose federation with the rest of the body. So that the octopus already presents a kind of interesting political model of decentralized power in its kind of neuronal arrangements. This is my other favorite example of something like that, which is this is a forest called Pando in Pennsylvania. And the thing is, Pando is a forest, but also a single organism. Something that, again, has only been realized kind of relatively recently. Pando is the largest known example of a quivering aspen, in that this one entire root system is a single organism of which the individual trees are merely clonal shoots thereof. And in fact, this that's it basically. That this entire forest is not, as we think, a thing of individual trees. Is kind of one vast organism that is in the kind of Wikipedia top 10 of largest organisms, oldest organisms. Pando might be dying. In fact, they're pretty sure Pando is dying, but Pando also probably has been dying for about 10,000 years. So this one might not be our fault. If we're starting to think about the intelligences and agencies of non-human things, the things that has to encompass, like forests that are single organisms, is already like deeply challenging to our concept of what a thing or a person is. And forests are a place in which these kind of realizations are being worked out to an extraordinary degree. I will remind me to say something else about forests at the end. The discovery of the vast amount of communication that is occurring at all times between living organisms, but particularly in forests, old growth forests, which therefore have healthy soils. I'm now quite distressed by seeing potted plants, because I think they must be really lonely when you understand how much old growth forests are communicating under the ground. And when I say communicating, there's all kinds of stuff that's going on there. But it also includes forms of solidarity, I see it as, of sharing of nutrients. When some plants are ill, other plants pass them nutrients. This happens across species. It's not just within single species. It's mediated by mycorrhizal networks, which are basically lots of wiry kind of fungus stuff under the ground. It's a whole lot of stuff going on. And basically, when I, only quite recently, started to learn more and more about this, I feel like I've been deaf my entire life. Because I walk down a street and I know there's a conversation happening here, and a dialogue and forms of communication that I wasn't even aware of. And I find myself as someone who has always been obsessed with technology and its particular formulations, to just be kind of wildly aware of a whole other world of possibilities that I hadn't even kind of looked into before. How am I doing for time? All right. But also because I'm me, I can't just leave it at cool animal stories, though I would really like to. I also want to start thinking through, and again, this is very, very early days, what are some of the implications of thinking about this kind of stuff as well, and what can it teach us in both directions? Because one of the examples I always use from AI in talking about how things might be different or better in our types of thinking is actually that game example that I denigrated earlier of Alphago. Because it has a really interesting precedent, which is, if you don't know the story, when Garry Kasparov was beaten by Deep Blue, the computer that IBM built to beat him, he was pissed off. But he came back the next year with a game called Advanced Chess. Advanced Chess is a form of chess, where you're basically allowed to use a computer. So human-computer teams. And this was really interesting for chess. It produced all kinds of really interesting strategies. It also, one of the interesting results of many was that it turned out that basically a human using a computer with help will beat a way better, more powerful computer. There's something that happens in the collaboration rather than this kind of oppositional form that actually produces new and radically interesting strategies and allows for a kind of combinatorial intelligence that's better than whatever our measure of higher intelligence was. And I've been trying to figure out how do you apply that in these different technological, how do you apply it, say, to modern forms of AI, which we don't understand in the way of Deep Blue? How do you talk about it in terms of plants and other things? And one of the things I've been doing, we were talking just now about alternative forms of technology that are opposed to the current structures we have at present, building other ones. Many are possible. There's also many parts of computer history and technological history which aren't too talked about, which kind of point towards this in certain ways. Right at the birth of modern computation is Turing's universal machine. This is a kind of version of one. This is the original computer. This is the thing that made computers possible. What he called the decision machine. That's like a strip of tape where you write the ones and zeros. And this is the form of computation we have at present. And it's the one that's come to define all of our lives. Absolutely, as we've been hearing all day, so many of these decisions and the ways in which our lives and our societies and our bodies are shaped by this binary 1-0 calculative process. What's lesser known is that within one of his very first papers on probability and decidability, in which Turing describes the decision machine, which has come to be known as the universal machine, he also described what he called an oracle machine. And he said the oracle machine, he doesn't say anything about the oracle machine. He says the oracle machine is basically like this, except there's something else you can consult there, which gives you the answer when it doesn't know it. So it's basically a way to allow for the problems that computation doesn't allow for. And in his footnote, he says, I can't tell you what the Oracle machine actually is, except it's not a machine. But like right at the beginning of computation, he's saying like there is something that is not computable, that is, does not belong to the domain of computability that we already understand. This whole conversation we're having is about those limits, but it's kind of right there at the beginning that you need to ask something else. You need to have a different way of thinking involved in these kind of decision-making processes, one that for me is like everything that is not about a computer, that is other people, that is other cultures, that is other places, that is other beings in all of these different forms. How am I doing for time? Okay. I'm good? Okay, I'll talk about this guy as well then. This is one of my weird hero, anti-hero type people. I admire anyone who can go from like that portrait to that portrait over the course of not actually that long. This is Stafford Beer, who's a British cybernetician. The cyberneticians basically believed in all the things that we now think are evil, in that you could kind of govern the world through various applications of computation, but some of them were properly bonkers and came up with, and kind of remained quite weird. And Beer was one of the more interesting ones because he kept pushing at that. And he's best known for things that look like this. He's the founder of what came known as scientific management, which is all of kind of computational management theory, that you could automate industrial processes, you could control factories automatically, and all this kind of stuff. He was kind of a guru of computational business in the 60s. And lots of diagrams that look like this, where everything is calculated and kind of arranged. What's brilliant about Beer is, well, first of all, he tried this on a bunch of factories, and one thing he realized was that the computers weren't good enough to do what he wanted to do. So he started thinking about other types of computers that he could build. And so what he did was he tried to build a computer out of a pond. In his basement in the late 1960s, there's no pictures of the actual pond, unfortunately, I've been able to find so far. But he said he had it running for several months in his basement. It's like a huge pond that he filled with buckets of water from local ponds. So it was filled with plants, but also kind of little water boatmen and kind of little wriggly bacterial type things. And then he suspended lights and water and sensors above and tried to train the plants and animals to control a factory, and he hooked it up to a big British steel factory outside Sheffield. And then he's tried to put iron filings in there, but that made all the fish magnetic, which didn't work. All this kind of mad stuff. But he was trying to open up a computational system to a natural environment in kind of this way. These are some of the things that I feel are kind of latent within our technologies. And it's worth mentioning him again because Beer is also the guy behind CyberSyn. If you don't know this is the control room for CyberSyn, which was Chile's national cybernetic plan under Salvador Allende, where he planned to cyberneticize the entire country to produce perfect socialist, highly automated socialist utopia. But unfortunately, he was killed by the CIA. Allende, not Beer, and all we're left with were the cool chairs. But I put it in there because there's a political dimension to these things, which I'm trying to slowly force in here as well, which is that these implications for non-human intelligence, is what we're realizing about them, have major consequences, particularly when they start to dovetail with our technologies. This is one of my favorite bits. This is deep history of computation. This is one of the first earliest pieces of technology for democracy. This is the Cleritarian from ancient Athens. This was set up, one of several stones that probably stood in the agora of Athens in about 300 BC, right when we invented democracy, which was massively flawed from the start. When it was invented in Europe, or that frame of Greek democracy we've got till now. But one of the things that it got right, in my opinion, was that it was a form of sortition. Sortition is opposed to election in the fact that you don't vote for who you think should be in charge. They're selected at random. And this was the machine that did that. Now, to be clear, there was a lot of problems with this. The suffrage at that time was only property-owning men over 30. Something like 75% of the population of ancient Greece were slaves. There's a lot that can be done better in other areas of this. But sortition was that they believed that everyone who was a citizen should be able to have a chance in charge. And they'd come along, and each one of these would be a name tag. ID tags useful in this case because someone would then pour like a bucket of balls down a tube that ran through this big bick of stone, and whoever was on particular one of those rows would join the Senate for the day, or go and be a judge, or take up all of these roles within the city. They believed that democracy actually was something that should belong to everybody, and they used a form of visible technology to enforce this, which is why I like this, because it's not just like the randomization and the genuine democratization of governance. It's also something that stood in the market square, right? Where anyone could come down and look at it and understand it, which is the opposite of today's opaque, kind of invisible technologies that we've been hearing so much about. I'm going to go on a lot. I'm not going to talk about von Neumann now because I'd rather get to the end of the conversation another time. But there's a reason if you want to ask later. What I will say is that these forms of sortition, I've got 10 minutes. Brilliant, I'm going back to von Neumann. I promise not to take all that up. So what's brilliant about von Neumann, I should say, sortition has other roots, not just in democracy, this idea of randomness as something that might actually be useful to understand is not just present within our democracies at birth, something that we then lost, is also present within sciences in really, really interesting ways. So this is Clara Dan and John von Neumann, who met in 1936 at the roulette table in Monte Carlo, and then went on to work at Los Alamos during the war on the first atomic bomb, and also then on the very first, the first fully programmed computer, essentially, there's various firsts. But they're there at the birth of both the atomic bomb and the computer, and the two things were very deeply connected. But several of those discoveries were made entirely possible by the realization that the process they participated in Monte Carlo, the process of randomization, was actually how we deal with the complexities of a computational future. Because they discovered that when they were doing, particularly the nuclear calculations, that these calculations were so incredibly complex that it was not possible to calculate them in the ways that things had been calculated before, right? They couldn't just do the sums because there were so many sums to do. When you're talking about the number of electrons that are coming out from a nuclear core at the moment of implosion and then explosion, that maths was just too complicated. And so what they did was they developed a thing called the Monte Carlo method. Stan Ulam and a few other people were involved, but the Monte Carlo story is best. And what that meant was that you'd basically select at random some of those electrons, some of those calculations, and if you did enough of them, you'd probably get a good enough guide, right? And that understanding that random simulation of vast amounts of scientific data is actually as good as a straightforward calculation is something that is now like a basis of most of our sciences around data, but I think is poorly understood in the rest of the world, which sees calculation and computation as being essentially deterministic. That is something that's very rule-based and very fixed, and provides a kind of guide, again, from technology itself. And this is the bit that I'm always interested in, is when accounting of the technology, which is often problematic, also allows us to rethink some other things. The modern update of the Claritarian is what's known as the Citizens' Assembly. This is a form of governance that has been tried in a number of countries, but most interestingly and most successfully, probably most recently in Ireland, which is this example. So a few years ago, Ireland did this kind of democratic experiment, an experiment within democracy called the Citizens' Assembly. And the Citizens' Assembly is a process by which, it's a sortition-based process. People are selected at random. They selected 100 people from across the entire population of Ireland. It's weighted slightly to ensure really full representation of different age groups and so on and so forth. But it is 100 people from across the entire country who've never met before, who may come from all kinds of different backgrounds and viewpoints. And they put them in a hotel for 6 weeks, and they give them a question or a subject, and they ask them to recommend policy. And they have presentations from experts, and they have kind of moderated debates and whatever, but the responsibility for that thinking rests with these 100 people. The results of this have been amazing, right? So the very first thing that the Assembly was asked to consider was the abortion law in Ireland. And the result of their deliberations was we should have a referendum, and the result of that referendum was the liberalization of the abortion law. But this was a subject that not only most people thought would never change in Ireland, with deeply conservative Catholic society, but also was considered so toxic that most politicians wouldn't even talk about it. Like that option was just not even on the table. But the Citizens' Assembly, this assembly of 100 random people of no political background, or possibly all of them, came together and weren't just capable of discussing it, weren't just capable of coming to a consensus, which is something that we're told is just not really possible in our modern kind of media fractured echo chamber age. But actually, their conclusion was more radical than anything the politicians had been able to put together, through the framework of regular operation of the politics. And then that happened again. And then they did it again with climate change. And they came out with a bunch of recommendations that politicians had said, there's no way people will go for that, we've never even put that forward. And now Ireland has one of the most progressive climate policies in Europe because the parliament has to then debate and take forward things the Citizens' Assembly recommends. So something really, really interesting happens when you put together a random bunch of people from random backgrounds and they recommend things that are really quite extraordinary, that are both clear-sighted, thoughtful, critical, and quite radical at times. By which I mean like progressive and beyond what other people would consider. People are trying to understand what this is. What's the mechanism at work here? Why does this work? And there's a bunch of arguments for that, but the one that I find most compelling and worthy of careful thought is a thing that people refer to as cognitive diversity. Cognitive diversity is not the same as other forms of diversity. It's not the same as gender diversity or racial diversity or any other form, but it is pretty closely correlated with them. By which I mean you assemble cognitive diversity by getting as broad a range as people as possible together. What it means is those people come from as many different cognitive backgrounds as possible. And what it says that, like, whatever that background might be, when you're addressing thorny, complex, new, novel problems like climate change, which requires new types of thinking, new strategies, what you need is not a self-selected or elected group of experts, and this is not anti-expert precisely, it's just saying this is interesting, who come from the broadest possible range of cognitive strategies to all bump off each other and think about them. And out of that, you get these kind of radical and very different ways of thinking as a cumulative effect of all these different forms of cognition. And the reason I find that and all these questions around randomness and it's the various sources we can find it in interesting is because we've reached the point in which, for me, the two things I've been talking about meet, right? Because if you, on the one hand, acknowledge that the best way of addressing novel and previously unthought, thorny problems is to have the widest possible range of cognitive diversity in play, and at the same time you start to acknowledge the cognitive abilities of non-humans, then you have to say that we have to extend our political assemblages to non-humans as well as to humans. That actually we have to think this thing together. And at present, I don't really know what that looks like. I'm not entirely sure. This is where it gets wobbly, and I'm uncertain. Are we talking about parliaments of trees? Are we talking about letting the dogs up on stage? Yes, frankly. I'm not entirely sure. I think we have a number of places we can start by doing it, and I want to bring that kind of thinking into all of our discussions, essentially, at this point. I'm hugely aware of a lot of the unintended biases as well, of the things I'm talking about. I'm hugely aware that, for me, I put up a symbol of the kind of biodiversities I want to engage in is a symbol of a forest, or a picture of a forest. And this is quite clearly a European forest, in this case. I want to know what it would look like to have these kind of conversations in a place that doesn't have forests, for example. Like where do you find these, what are the natures that we would draw on within these other places in order to bring these kind of questions into being? My first tendency as a technologist is immediately to kind of attempt to instrumentalize this in some way. This is a device for measuring the gaseous outputs of trees, right? Is this how we measure? Do we strap technology to everything else like we've strapped technology to ourselves, essentially, as a way of kind of instrumentalizing the world in order to get its opinions on what we're doing in some way? Like, that's, I hope, not entirely the direction we want to do, but it's my instinct to start playing with this stuff immediately to get it through. There was interesting and long discussions about the role of indigenous knowledges yesterday, which I bring up only because I've been thinking about it a lot, and I objected to the ways in which, well, the word indigenous was being used. I don't care about that. What I care about is the fact of non-Western knowledges being quite obviously and most important to talking about the different forms of knowledge and relationships with the natural world. The thing that was interesting about that discussion is that it seemed to figure those kind of knowledges as being somehow more pristine or closer to nature. That's not what I mean when I talk about them. Because I went to look from one of my favorite writers, Robin Wall Kimmerer, about human relationships with nature. Robin Wall Kimmerer is a plant ecologist and also a carrier of traditional knowledges in America, who had two things that I thought were relevant to say after that renunciation of instrumentation, and this question of how we speak to and listen to and bring into political assembly those non-humans, and I wanted to finish with those two lines. This is it. Plants answer questions by the way they live, by their responses to change. You just need to learn how to ask. It's a reminder that the answers that we are looking for when we try and speak to and communicate with non-humans are answers to questions that we haven't learned to ask yet, in the same way that the Gibbons example from earlier was like a failure on our own part to recognize what was kind of at play here. And the second point is that experiments are not about discovery, but about listening and translating the knowledge of other beings, which is speaking to my example of the plant, the caterpillars and the plant's hearing, that these are requests to change our own way of thinking. The point of communicating and forming assemblies with non-humans has nothing to do with either instrumentalizing them, either appropriating from them, or putting them to our service. The point is to change ourselves. The point is to become different to what we are at present. The encounter with the non-human, for me, this is what I finally want to say. The encounter with the non-human is not a moment, it's a moment of where we attempt to renounce domination. It's an attempt to not do that again. It's an acknowledgement of all of these different forms that exist differently to the human, that offer us a possibility to be different to how we are in the present, and therefore to act differently in the future. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, James. That was super. That was really excellent to hear. I have a bit of an advantage in that I've read a bit more of some secret manuscript that James circulated to me in advance of this. So I know also a little bit more about where this is going, which is super interesting. And I think that it would be quite good to tease some of that stuff out because it's there. I think part of it could begin by sort of saying, well, first of all, as in a broader context, I feel like we are in the Middle East. What's that? Non-human sounds that I definitely heard through my ears. No, from the perspective of the Middle East, I feel finally we have the upper edge on this discussion because of two things. We rarely have the upper edge as like Arabs, but we have two things here. One, and we're going to get to this, the dark side of the inclusion of the non-human, which is Sophie, is she called Sophie?
Yeah.
The citizen robot in Saudi Arabia. That's the first one we run into. The second one, a recent drone attack by the Israelis in Lebanon, the political leader the leader of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, claimed that this as a suicide attack. The drone landed and exploded. And he referred to it as a suicide attack. So that's twice in recent history that we in the Middle East have referred to we have brought subjectivity to non-human things. Of course, both of them have this ideological dimension to them. Hezbollah have a vested interest in rebarbarizing drones, right? Something that actually you've been doing in your own work for some years. If you don't know James's work on the drone shadow. So you and Hassan Nasrallah, you have some interesting crossover there. But in all seriousness, yeah, and then of course the question that you raise in your in the more expanded version of this research, which is that that Sophie, I can't believe she's called Sophie, the robot that has the citizenship in Saudi, actually comes before many rights that are given to human agents within the same context. So the kind of what I was getting at is that there's this interplay in your work, which I find very interesting, between both the necessity to form new types of inclusion to non-human others, but also to understand that it hasn't been a linear process, right? That non-humans have often attained subject status before actual humans, right? It's not like humans achieve it and then now we're going to continually open into a kind of linear form of progress, but actually there has been strategies throughout history to show that actually natural, non-human have actually precluded the possibility for humans to achieve rights. And that's one of the reasons why Edward Said hated environmentalists so much, right? And it actually seemed kind of anachronistic when you read now Said, he hates like environmentalism. You're like, hey man, it's climate change, you know, like you didn't see this coming. But actually he hated it because he saw in the kind of pristine myth, this thing you pointed at the end, the same logic that put the land without a people, right? Land without a people is the failure to see the people for the land, right? In both cases, a kind of like environmental sense, say we cannot separate the indigenous from nature, right? Which is in fact, you know, there's much argument to say that actually indigenous people have been mobilizing technologically advanced ways of thinking. It's not that they're natural people, right? And so the idea of a pristine myth and a land without people. And those both as agents of kind of colonialism. So what I'm trying to get at is that entanglement in your work, really, and that sort of relation between the sort of delinearization of inclusion in a way.
Yes, that's a lot of things. The drone one, which is, I hate them so much, and I was hoping not to speak about them, but I have to speak about them now because you raised them. The drone one's a super interesting example, I always think as well, like in that case of the kind of, a lot of this conversation is about anthropomorphization, or at least that bit of the conversation is. So in this case, we're kind of anthropomorphizing the drone as something that that can suicide, essentially. I've used drones for a long time as an example of more what I think I'm talking about here, actually, which is the point at which humans resist the dehumanizing effects of technology to such an extent that technology becomes a useful example of the humanity of humans. And the example I'm thinking of is the fact, a few years ago, the US Department of Defense proposed a medal for a new air combat medal for US Air Force personnel that would be given for good air combat. And there was a massive outcry about this for two reasons. One of which was that drone pilots would be eligible. And the other one was that it would be above the kind of the rankings in the medal table above the Purple Heart, which is what you get for being actually wounded. And as these drone pilots were perceived as not even putting themselves in any form of harm's way, there was a huge outcry that they would be eligible for a combat medal, essentially. And it was actually hastily withdrawn, and everyone was like, ooh. And which was part of the kind of idea, an important idea to me, that that we don't really believe in now, but was prevalent for a long time, that serious, meaningful human relationships were not possible when mediated by screens, and that the whole world of technology was kind of alien to human emotion. The drones continue to be relevant in that it's fairly now well established that drone combat pilots, who I have sympathy for as humans, suffer PTSD at the same, if not higher rate than combat pilots. So that there's traumatic, emotional, psychological effects, which are after all what affect most fighters in some way, to the same degree, despite that level of mediation. So the drone is the charismatic object in that kind of discussion that permits us to see that form of relationship. The second thing you mentioned, which is germane to this, is the example of Sophia, who's just awful, who's just this really crap chatbot in a kind of creaky Android head, basically, who the Saudi government gave citizenship to, over and above human women. And a lot of other people. But, as part of a discussion around AI personhood, which, as I said in the examples of corporations, is an interesting example, because corporations already have personhood, personhood. Sophia doesn't have any of that, but corporations do. They have protected speech and action and a number of other things. So non-humans have personhood. This is now established. And there's really interesting, so there's an argument made that one way to give rights to non-humans is to give them these forms of legal personhood, give them legal standing, it gives them recognition within the law and associated systems. There's a big effort underway in the US. There's a particular thing called the Non-Human Rights Project, which is applying for rights, civil rights, for non-humans, primarily, actually they've done a couple of elephants, but primarily chimpanzees in captivity. That was the kind of grouping they started with. They're filing habeas corpus requests on behalf of chimpanzees. Habeas corpus is like one of the foundational pieces of Western jurisprudence, because it means literally produce the body. Like you have to show up in court, and it's a way of the courts asserting their authority. It gives a body to the legal subject, and that legal subject can then demand freedom. So far, this hasn't worked, but it's going to keep trying. It worked in Brazil with an orangutan. An orangutan got given legal rights and got basically given a better enclosure, but a much better enclosure. I mean, it worked, and it worked by giving this orangutan legal protection. Animal rights people got really excited. The judge then ruled it was only higher apes that could apply for this, so there's still a whole bunch of speciesist stuff going on. The really interesting example, I think, on this one, though, is the river in New Zealand. In New Zealand, a river got given legal personhood. And that is the result of 200-odd years of campaigning by local Maori groups for whom the river had always been a person and whose exclusion from the legal system was not just a kind of contemporary idea of how we might change the legal system, it was actually a recognition by the legal system of a different way of accounting for our place on the earth. And that's what makes that example way more interesting to me than the examples of kind of ape personhood and so other, because we're not making the non-human conform to a justice system that we know to be flawed and just in so many ways. We're fundamentally changing, like they had to set up a system of legal guardianship and produce new laws to account for the river rather than making the river account for itself. And so there's something very interesting happening in that moment. I think it's a very, very long way from those points at which personhood becomes the mechanism, and I essentially distrust it because I distrust all systems. But it's a nice way of thinking about it, particularly when you can start saying that a river has a personhood and that people understand a certain way of thinking about the river through an example like the justice system, which they're already unfortunately familiar with. There were some other things as well, but that's...
No. I mean, it's not. I guess it's perfect, your response, because that is the stuff that would eventually kind of come into your research and what I wanted to pull out. And it's also this kind of political dimension, overtly political dimension of where these logics are going, how they're being used, and which path they take. I suppose in continuation with that, what I was thinking about when I was reading your text and when you were speaking today was also Jane Goodall. And, perhaps you would say that, okay, this kind of tool use she identifies is anthropomorphic or whatever, but people hadn't, until her, understood that that was possible, right? And she was also a non-expert person. So Jane Goodall, who was, where was she actually? Congo, right? Yeah. So what I'm trying to say is that is her expertise in a way to do with being someone who understood exclusion from knowledge, exclusion from the hegemonic order of knowledge? Could she understand that, of course, chimpanzees had intelligence because she was also of a section of the population, women, who were excluded from forms of kind of like knowledge, right? Forms of being also possible to speak, also possible to express certain forms of and participate within of a world of knowledge. You see what I mean? So these kind of forms of political exclusion, I guess, push people into understanding or in models of ways of thinking about other forms of intelligence. And I think where I'm going with that is your kind of like your position on othering, because what's interesting in your work is there's two kind of contradictory positions, and I think contradiction is interesting. I'm not saying that that's a problem. I think on the one hand, you began by saying, okay, we are different, and you know, the plant is a perfect example. We simply don't understand the kind of forms of sensing. But then with also what needs to be done in your work is the kind of microbiome stuff, right? That we are also not individuals, right? So there's a necessity to think otherness, but there's also a necessity to kind of erode individuals, to understand humans as also environments, right? In and of themselves. So I just, it's these kind of, I just want to push you more on these kind of the politics of otherness.
I think that's a really productive one. I'm not sure I can speak to Jane Gould, not knowing her background or her skills or whatever particularly well. But from what I do know of her work, I think it's obviously easier to, not easier, but I think a lot of it came simply from close observation and open mind, which is obviously easier if you don't come with a lot of institutional baggage. I would say that much. I feel much I could say about that. But also sustained contact in the environment and so on and so forth. There were a lot that went into her work. But to this latter thing, yes, we are neither sole individuals sovereign from the rest of nature, nor are we like capable of understanding everything. Like we're all parts of the same big floaty soup, and it's that kind of like. That is part of the kind of cognitive, spiritual disassociation that is the complement to the kind of the political. By disassociation, I mean like removing ourselves from the center in many, many ways, but particularly not to a new center. Like that's kind of crucial. This. One of the problems I have thinking about this stuff is there's a lot of very reasonable arguments to be made against the way I'm using a lot of words, at least one of which is intelligence. When scientists would just be like, no, you do have a quite good definition of intelligence. That's not it. These things are intelligence, these things aren't. And I'm like, I want to expand all of the things. I want to, and the process at work there is not that by saying animals or plants have intelligence that we degrade the form of intelligence that we're holding on to so tightly. It's that we expand it, that it becomes part of a greater and more interesting whole. That seems to me to be a very powerful possibility. And a lesson, again, that we need to learn from most of our forms of power and exclusion and all the kind of cutting into divisions we were talking about yesterday, that the expansion of who we consider to be worthy of political power, worthy of speech, worthy of the status of being fully members of community can be a process of expansion and enlargement rather than perceived to be a loss of certain kinds of power. But that immediately sets up, this was the final part of your last question, the Said part. That also sets up the fact that this is going to be a political fight because the people who have the power, or the people who consider themselves to be intelligent, they're not going to want to lose this. This will be a conflict in kind of many, many ways. And it's going to play out in all kinds of particular ways. And I think and the reason we need to think about the bases of environmentalism, for example, in one case of their own, is that I firmly believe we're not very far from very, very dark forms of environmentalism that are future forms of totalitarian control, which are going to be, the moment the far right in Europe realizes it can claim to be pure in an environmental notion, it's going to have even more justification for those walls that are going up. Like, I see that as a very, very, very close future possibility. And it will happen in many ways in many different places. In the same way that we need, the reason we've been trying to rethink borders and justice systems for so long is there's many reasons we've been doing it, but we know this situation is going in a particular direction, and we need to change the way we think about it as those things become enforced. So one of the reasons I've been doing a lot of work on borders and migration and on justice systems is because those things are about to get tested, particularly by climate change, right? Like, there's going to be 1 billion people on the move in the next 20 years, probably less. All the predictions are worse than we think, right? And those borders are going to harden. And environmentalism will then be used as a thing to harden those borders further. So these are not fluffy issues around how much we love plants. These are attempts to impart an environmental consciousness that will actually have deep effects on the justice system in not very long. That's one way of it.
Which is okay. I had one last question for James. Very quick one. Should I do it?
Audience.
Audience?
Go on. We can talk about it so endlessly.
It was quick. It was really quick. Moderators being moderated.
Moderators being moderated. Thank you so much. I love that this conversation has gone towards the environmentalism and conservation, because this is one area that I think brings in all of these things that we've been talking about the last couple of days. The idea of indigeneity and indigenous communities with knowledge and conservation and power and external power dynamics, because this is a conversation that we have, for example, in Kenya right now, because we have a handful of European settlers, descendants of settlers, who own obscene amounts of land that are technically idle, but it's complicated at the expense of indigenous communities, whatever that means. And there's constant violence around it, and how the law is being shaped around it very much reflects these conversations about other ways of knowing and other ways of being. And I love the way that you've tried to open up different ways of thinking about being and belonging and understanding the world and how the world works. I just wanted to push a little bit on this idea of using existing. We were laughing about this before, but just to put it very crudely, are we getting to the point where it's time to start eating the rich? And stop clapping, that's not a good thing to clap. And the reason why I put this is because I'm a recovering lawyer. And one of the biggest fallacies that there is about what the law is that the law can be a tool of social change. The reason why we study all of these remarkable cases, Brown v. Board of Education, Lawrence v. Texas, all of that stuff, is because they're outliers. The 98% of the law is about preserving the status quo. So there's cases that you're citing to about using the law to protect the rivers, for example, have led to the very tensions that we're talking about. We're protecting a river, but the people who are drinking from the river are dying, are not able to access things that we're saying are integral to life and liberty and all of that stuff. So, and kind of asking you to cast an eye onto the future, the next 5 years. You have a research project that you're putting together. What kind of things do you see in terms of the revolutionary import of what your research is pointing towards? What is the next thing that we should be paying attention to, thinking about, seeing coming down the pipeline?
because I don't have an answer for that quite yet, I just want to say quickly, the river one is not about protecting the river exclusively. The river is particularly about bringing the river into a community with people. And again, I say I don't think a justice-based approach is sufficient at all. But that particular example was particularly about the river, like making the river safe to drink by giving the river itself these kind of rights of personhood, so that it can't be polluted, and so on. But what is the thing that's coming? I think there is some kind of I don't know. I honestly don't. I mean, that's honestly. I've told you almost everything that I've thought about it. No. But I mean, the thing that I see happening is climate change really, really quickly. That's the thing. Like that's the big thing that's happening, and all of this work is about like what are meaningful, like useful responses to that in the present. Some of those are mitigatory. Some of them are just living through it. Other ones are preparing for some of the things that are going to happen. And this has been, I know, I started doing the drones because actually it was a process about, like, I thought it was better to work on anti-military technologies, because while military logic decided everything, we were never going to take action in the environment, but like that moment is clearly like done, so let's just work on the kind of mitigatory stuff. I want to know how we make better decisions than we have in the past, and how we understand that that's what we need to do as well. Like, how do you spread an awareness of that? And I also want to make it a process of discovery and learning. This is possibly quite key, the thing that I'm most interested in at present, alongside this process, because it's the thing I'm learning about, like, forget all the crazy animal stuff. Technology alone is that I've spent some time now telling everyone how terrible all the tech is, trying to change behaviors as well, and realizing the scale at which that is possible, and the things that are needed to do it. And I've come to, down to quite small scale, thinking about education and the ways in which people learn tend to be a process of learning and discovery for themselves. So rather than telling people about how technology it is, how do we work together to change our political relationships to those technology? Most of that involves kind of building stuff, right? You have some understanding how these things work. And now I'm like, okay, well, how do I apply some of that logic to this relationship with the environment or relationship to nature? One of which is obviously going to be like knocking loads of the walls out, so that there's some connection with the things. Like, if you don't spend your time with non-humans, you're not going to notice their intelligence and these kind of things. So we need to, those things have to become part. That's how they start to become a part of our thinking. I think we're saying, right now, what is missing from this conversation, and it doesn't have to be a talking plant, but it might need to be more around us at all times. Though that would be pretty cool.
But I also see it a bit differently, because I hear your point totally, but I see it quite differently in what James is doing, because the law I see is just one of several kind of instruments, including science, including other kinds of technology, that open these small windows into formally blocked paths of communication, right? So it's not like he's only pursuing this path to justice, but there is within of justice also these kind of moments to open, right? Do you see what I mean? Instead of it's only one of a few.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, my question comes back to that bridging of communication and how we can possibly learn how to listen to other life forms, and it might come about with a new technological revolution that is coming in the next years. it's in the making for a while, and it comes about because of a material problem. Most computer chips are silicon-based, but the material itself doesn't allow for the next phase in evolution, which is this shrinking at the same time as the doubling of information that you can store on it. The law of Moore doesn't allow silicon to be the main ingredient in the next computer evolution. So a lot of the work on finding alternatives has been on biological computers, wet computers based on DNA and RNA, and that's exactly the stuff that we share with other life forms. So I'm wondering if computers, the hardware of computers actually change in such a way that we can internalize it and we share it with other life forms. Maybe that helps to communicate with each other. It's an open thought and half of a question. Could that be a solution?
I think it's a really, there's a, like, I mean, it is, I think, where possibly the kind of examples from the history of computation like start to kind of reinsert themselves back into the narrative again. Well, yeah, you made me think of Ingrid Burrington, who's been mentioned a couple of times already today. He talks about computers as being essentially enchanted rocks, which is what they are. When computers become kind of enchanted plants or enchanted bodies, there may be something interesting there. I'd say what I said about the justice process. Like, it's only interesting if it changes the fundamental processes of like that system of logic and the way it affects everyone's lives. Because I don't think like the you know, as nice an idea it is, the kind of biological computer will be so foreign to any form of life that we recognize it, that it's not going to make us love life more. And in all probability, because of its deployment by systems of power, it will remain within a kind of a logic, the kind of binary logic that produces the computational stuff of the present. But if it were to produce a different computational logic that was more what, I'm not sure, but less like the kind of rigid instantiations of computational logic that we have at present, then that would be a very nice, interesting thing to happen. And it exists in many other forms in kind of computational history as well. One of my favorite examples is hydrological computers, which use water instead of electrons, which gets like messy and complicated and can perform different types of logic, just as biological computers may be possible of doing. But I'm also scared of I don't think a technological solution answer is necessarily the one either. At least I don't think it will be the major planet. But it's nice.
Any more questions? Over here there's some questions.
You know, maybe this is not completely a question, more like a comment or so. I'm really ashamed that I forgot the name of the artist, but so it's American.
Good start to the comment.
Yeah, it's an American bio artist that like. So he created I think this year or maybe last year some kind of artificial bacteria, and basically this bacteria I didn't know before, but like the sweat. Yeah, and it's basically the sweat that we are producing as a result of the labor, let's say, is basically produced by the bacteria that lives here, and so this is the smell that we are like sensing. It's basically produced by the bacteria. So the guy produced artificial bacteria, and okay, it's one of those like bio works and stuff like this. But then in discussion, there was a notion of like bacterial Marxism, in sense of like. So what is our relation to the bacteria? It's basically we are transferring. We have like this kind of colonial relation, or like relation of power over this bacteria that's basically doing a labor instead of us. And then there was like a discussion about like the labor rights in this context of us and bacteria that live together with us in some ecosystem. No? Did you like? in your research?
No, is the answer. But the questions of labor and responsibility and the power within it are, yeah, totally there.
But then I would really I stay with that idea for like months now, like bacterial Marxism, and then I was thinking about our horses and like the moment of like industrial revolution, automatization, like how those horses felt. It's kind of liberation, no? Like now finally we don't need to carry all of those cars and stuff like this. Now there is some kind of machines or whatever. So lots of different questions, no?
Yeah, I mean, it didn't end well for most of those horses, which should tell you quite a lot about our current dreams of kind of like technological automation-based Marxism kind of thing. That like the end of automation replacing workers of human or non-human forms doesn't mean everyone gets to hang out in the field being cute. It's rapid drop in population. But I want to, there's one of the things I have been learning about is the number of different forms of relationship that have always existed between humans and non-humans. Bacteria on the current list, though, it's a good question as to where they fall. I'd always been sort of, there's a fairly standard, I don't know if it's anthropological distinction of this kind of like boundary distance question between humans and non-humans, that we have the pets and they have certain rights and we have certain responsibilities towards them, and then there's livestock. There's different responses you can have towards these. We treat them differently. We have different emotional relationships with them. So, and then there's wildlife, like out beyond there, and that's that. But that's I've been realizing that's a really, really modern distinction. I mean, if you go back long enough, you start to see the moments in which different non-humans chose to come and live within the domus, meaning the kind of the settlement or whatever it was. There's certain species that we domesticated directly. There's other species which semi-domesticated themselves, possibly out of choice. There's species that chose to live alongside us. Pigeons and seagulls and things like that at this point in their species evolution completely depend upon us, but we actually have no direct choice relationship or compatible relationship. And there's other ones. My favorite ones are the ones to which we both live completely separate and sort of wild lives, but cooperate entirely. My favorite example of which is the honey guide. Does everyone know about honey guides, which are small birds that live across a lot of Africa and Asia, but are particularly well known in some places for showing people where to find the honey. By which honey guides recognize individual humans and will work with a particular human, and that person can go out into the field and make a particular call. The honey guide knows it's their human, will appear and then take that person to a hive, because the honey guide can't open the hive. But it knows that humans can, so the human will break it open and then leave some honey for the honey guide, these little birds. And the honey guide lives wild, and the human lives as humans do, but they have learned to cooperate. It's unclear how long this has been going on, but it's possibly since pre-humans. It's quite possible that this relationship developed pre-Homo sapiens. Which predates the domestication of the dog and these kind of power relationships we have animals in quite interesting ways that perhaps our earliest relationships with animals our earliest ones were definitely eating them, weren't they? But subsequent to that, there were other forms of sociality and relationships with non-humans became possible a long, long time ago. So maybe we should love our little bacterial Marxist friends.
Okay, well, on that note, thank you so much, James. It's been amazing to hear you talk.
Thank you.
So thank you.